Durkheim and Mauss famously suggested that religion gives us the categories by which we come to think and conceptualize the world. They suggested that concepts like time, space, and causation are fundamentally given to us by religion. This makes sense if we look within the Western tradition, whereby Christianity projects a kind of linear trajectory of time whereby we are moving towards, in the end of times, God's kingdom being established. We also understand that God, having caused all things, led to a series of events where one thing leads to another. Hence, we understand how causation, time, and space are derived from these concepts. This brings us on to a deeper point where religion gives us a fundamental philosophical and metaphysical framework by which to think about the world. Famously, Al-Ghazali thought that the a priori truths, the awwaliyat, first philosophical principles, are self-evident in and of themselves, and they do not need any proof to their existence, because otherwise the mind cannot conceptualize about the world without said a priori truths. And many religious theologians have sought to use such first philosophical principles to base their worldview on. They thought that these were the basis for sound reasoning and sound conceptualizing of the world. In fact, there was a classical sect of Greek philosophy that was present, and it was also present in the Islamic world, having been influenced by Greek teachings. And these were the Sophists, who denied first philosophical principles, and they denied the existence of things. Of course, there are differences in them, but generally speaking, they were subject to many refutations by various classical theologians. For example, specifically in regards to the Islamic tradition, the famous theologian Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani, in his commentary of the Nasafi Creed, mentions briefly a refutation of this sect. In many cases, many classical, scholastical, and Islamic sort of theologians sought to resolve the issues that arose from not having a fundamental set of principles to think about the world, which would ultimately lead to this kind of skepticism and doubt about existence itself, by establishing these first principles so to give us a fundamental framework from which we can think about the world. One of the issues that often arises with a lot of Enlightenment philosophy and after the Enlightenment, for example, with the likes of Nietzsche and postmodernism, is there's this very strong deconstructionalist trend, or this tendency to be very skeptical about everything. And this often leads to very absurd positions, and it doesn't often make sense to the common person as to how a philosopher could think those things, but it makes sense within the framework in which they are operating. However, to deny existence or to be skeptical about existence itself often leads one into very catastrophic blunders and errors. And so, existence and the existence and reality of things being established as they are, as is mentioned by classical Islamic theologians, is a kind of lifeline to the philosopher to help him set up a worldview that is not subjected to constant doubt and skepticism. As per the Islamic theologian An-Nasafi, he mentions that حقائق الأشياء ثابتة, that the realities of things are established, meaning their essences are real, they aren't mere abstractions or mere illusions of the mind, and to say otherwise would be a quite delirious thing to assert. Of course, this does not mean that we should take metaphysics or philosophy, take the teachings of those who have studied these sciences and operated within them for the centuries, and just take them blindly. We should, of course, approach all things with a grain of salt and be critical about the conclusions that are derived by these scholars, even if they are great thinkers in their own right. We should not be uncritical, and we should be investigating the things they say. In other words, we should not be blind followers. The biggest thing to be taken here would be that whilst we should have a foundational philosophical and metaphysical framework from which to understand the world, we should not be blind followers of such a framework. We should be evaluating the assumptions upon which we base this framework and constantly evaluating them. And also, just because we take certain foundational philosophical principles from the ancients, let's say, or we base our fundamental framework off of their worldview, does not mean that we have to blindly accept everything they say. One of the reasons the medieval Aristotelian worldview broke down was because there was simply too much that came to light that the ancients didn't know. Many scientific facts that we took for granted from the ancients just turned out to be completely and utterly wrong. Hence, the natural sciences, metaphysics, and philosophy, whatever these disciplines may be, should be utilized and operationalized in their proper place and their proper subject and proper object of study. And they should not be confused with each other. They should be studied in an interdisciplinary manner, but they should not necessarily interfere with one another. Of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, as a postmodernist, asserted that there are no sort of eternal truths, that there are no eternal facts as there are no eternal truths. And furthermore, that logic itself corresponds to principles or assumptions where nothing in the world of reality corresponds to it. Hence, of course, Nietzsche took this more skeptical approach, and whilst it's fair to obviously evaluate the assumptions that we hold, going to the other extreme of simply rejecting all of these assumptions outright perhaps isn't correct either. Thus, a synthesis perhaps, or coming to terms at least, with the importance of classical metaphysics and philosophy and the foundational principles upon which it is based, which can help us to form a more coherent worldview, but alongside that, adopting certain aspects of the skeptical approach of certain Enlightenment and post Enlightenment philosophers, and not just taking everything for granted, can be a useful thing for us to follow. So we should have, to a certain extent, the skeptical attitude of the later philosophers, whilst also following to a certain extent the philosophical principles of the earlier generations. Unfortunately, by giving up the metaphysical project, the Enlightenment philosophers ended up compromising a lot of what we assume to be true about the world, even up until the extent of the scientific project itself, which the Enlightenment sought to base itself upon. Hence, understanding the role of metaphysics and science in their respective places and understanding how they can help to facilitate one another but not compromise one another will be essential to forming a more coherent metaphysical and scientific worldview.